So, um, if you were to somehow go back in time, like right into the ancient world, and open up the physical clay ledgers of the administrators who...
The bureaucrats, basically.
Right, exactly. The ancient bureaucrats who constructed the Great Pyramids in Egypt or, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, you wouldn't actually find the laborers' payments recorded in gold.
Real, not...
You wouldn't find them in silver or even copper. You would find an ocean of a bristly, bitter, incredibly stubborn grass.
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
It is. Because we tend to think of the foundation of human civilization as these grand, sweeping ideas, right? Like law, religion, monumental architecture.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the actual physical engine of the ancient world was, well, essentially a weed from the Near East.
It completely upends how we usually look at history. I mean, we look at the monuments and completely ignore the fuel that built them.
Exactly. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We have an incredible set of research in front of us today, which is anchored by a comprehensive document that is simply titled Barley.pdf.
Very straightforward title.
Very straight to the point. And what makes this deep dive so compelling for you listening is that we aren't just going to list off agricultural statistics or planting depths. That would be incredibly dry.
Yeah, nobody wants a pure agronomy lecture today.
Right. Instead, this source material analyzes the crop through a highly specific psychological lens. It uses a subpersonality framework called Devon.
Which initially sounds like a very strange way to look at a plant. I mean, applying a human psychological profile to a grain of grass.
It sounds totally bizarre.
It does. But as you dig into it, it makes perfect sense. In this framework, the Devon persona represents stoicism. It represents, a profound resilience, a tendency to be pushed to the margins, and above all, it's about transformation through intense ordeal.
Okay, wow. Transformation through ordeal.
Yeah, it's a personality profile of something that never really demands the spotlight, but becomes absolutely structurally critical when it's placed under immense pressure.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how this unglamorous grass became the bedrock of taxation, the literal fuel of empires, and, the ultimate technology of human survival. We're looking at barley not just as a bowl of soup, but as a technology of endurance.
And that introduces this massive central paradox that we have to navigate today. Barley is the crop that built the very first human states by making labor mathematically countable. It is like the bureaucrat's dream grain.
Right.
Yet at the exact same time, it is the crop that humanity has historically shoved to the absolute fringes of the habitable earth. It is planted on the freezing high-altitude mountains and the arid, salty drylands where wheat would just shrivel up and die immediately.
So it's the foundation of the centralized state and the ultimate refuge of the outcast at the exact same time.
Exactly.
Which is, it's like a wild duality to wrap your head around. But to understand how it got to that point, we actually have to rewind about 11,000 years.
Back to the very beginning of agriculture.
Right, because before barley could build a city or stock a granary, humans had to strike a biological bargain with its wild ancestor. So let's talk about the biology of Hordeum vulgare. We are in the Neolithic period, right, in the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah, there are archaeological sites like Dra near the Dead Sea where we see the very first evidence of this transition happening.
And what's crucial to understand about wild barley in that era is that its evolutionary genius wasn't about producing a massive bounty of food.
No, not at all. I mean, if you pamper modern wheat with the perfect nitrogen balance, perfect soil, and a temperate climate, it will give you a staggering yield. It's greedy in a productive way.
Right. Wheat expects luxury.
Exactly. But barley's genius is sheer stubborn tolerance. It has an incredibly short growing season. It survives intense cold snaps, it handles drought, and it can grow in highly saline soils that would completely toxify other cereals.
Okay, so structurally, looking at our notes here, it comes in a few different architectural layouts, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of dictate how we've used it throughout history.
Yeah, the architecture of the plant is super important.
So you have two-row barley, where the kernels grow in these two neat, uniform rows along the central stem. And then you have six-row barley, which looks much more crowded and I guess has higher protein and enzyme levels.
Right, 6 rows often use more for animal feed because of that protein content.
Makes sense. Plus, you had this major distinction between hulled barley and hulless, or naked barley.
And that hull is a defining characteristic of the crop. The hull is essentially a suit of armor that is physically fused to the seed.
Wow. Fused to it.
Yeah, biologically, it protects the kernel from fungal diseases and harsh weather while it's out in the field. But from a human perspective, It is a total nightmare to process. You cannot just pick whole barley and eat it.
Right, you break your teeth.
Exactly. You have to thresh it, soak it, pound it, or pearl it to get that armor off. It demands serious, disciplined labor just to make it edible.
Which, if you think about it, fits right into that Devon subpersonality you mentioned earlier.
Oh, perfectly.
The utility is there, but you have to break through this heavily guarded, defensive exterior to actually access it. But here's the part of the domestication story that I really want you to explain to everyone, because it seems completely counterintuitive to me.
The brittle rachis.
Yes, the turning point for barley becoming a human crop was a genetic mutation involving something called a brittle rachis.
Right. So the rachis is basically the central stem that holds the individual seeds on the head of the grain.
Okay, so in the wild, this rachis is brittle. When the plant matures, the stem naturally shatters, scattering the seeds all over the ground so they can sprout next year. That's how it reproduces, right?
Naturally, yes. That's how it survives.
But the domesticated version has a non-shattering rachis. The seeds just stubbornly sit there on the stem. If you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, that is a catastrophic mutation for a wild plant.
It's essentially a death sentence in the wild.
Right. It's like a dandelion refusing to let its seeds blow away in the wind. How did early humans breed a fatal flaw into this plant? Did they, know what they were doing?
They absolutely did not know what they were doing.
Really?
Yeah. This wasn't a Neolithic farmer waking up with a genius agronomy blueprint. This was the result of blind, grinding, accidental repetition.
Okay, paint a picture for us.
Imagine you are an early human forager walking into a stand of wild barley. You have your woven basket. The plants that are behaving normally, the ones with the brittle rachis, have already shattered. Their seeds have fallen into the dirt and the mud.
And you obviously aren't going to sit there picking up individual seeds out of the mud one by one.
Exactly. That would burn more calories than you'd gain. So you sweep your basket through the stalks that are still holding their seeds. You are overwhelmingly harvesting the mutants.
Oh.
You are naturally selecting the plants that have this flawed, non-shattering trait, simply because those are the only seeds physically left available to be caught in your basket.
So when those foragers eventually take those seeds back to camp, maybe they drop a few near the fire or decide to purposefully plant them the next season, they are artificially concentrating that exact mutation.
Precisely. Over hundreds, maybe thousands of generations, humans fixed that non-shattering trait into the genetic population. The plant lost its ability to survive independently in the wild because it literally couldn't scatter its own seed anymore. It became entirely dependent on humans to harvest it and plant it.
Wow.
But in return, humans became entirely dependent on the plant for a reliable source of dense calories.
It's a mutual hostage situation.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
And bringing it back to that Devon framework from our sources, this is exactly what the research points out. Devon's transformation isn't some sudden theatrical lightning bolt of enlightenment. It's redemption through grueling repetition.
Yes.
The biology of the crop changed because it was handled, selected, and trusted over millennia. We locked ourselves into this highly restrictive relationship with the plant.
And because we locked ourselves into that relationship, the unique biological properties of barley, specifically its storability, triggered a cascade of consequences that gave birth to something entirely unprecedented.
Which is?
The centralized state.
Right. Okay, this takes us into a completely different realm. We're moving from the dirt of the Fertile Crescent into the bureaucracy of early empire. Because once you have a grain that doesn't shatter, you can harvest it in massive bulk.
Yeah.
And once you harvest it in bulk, you have to put it somewhere.
Exactly. We really need to look at the psychological and societal shift between a foraging society and an agricultural society here. Foraging is a system of immediate return. You hunt a gazelle, you gather some tubers, and you consume them within a few days.
Makes sense.
You cannot easily hoard a hunted gazelle for a year. Because you can't hoard it, it is very difficult for a chief or a king to monopolize the food supply and use it to control the population.
But grain is different. Farming is a delayed return system.
Highly delayed. You invest months of backbreaking labor, and all the calories arrive in one very short harvest window. Now, those calories have to last your entire society for the next 12 months. Barley is incredibly dry and hard. If you keep it out of the rain, it stores beautifully in a granary.
And here comes the trap.
Right. The moment you consolidate a society's entire food supply into a centralized granary, you have created a mechanism for absolute political control.
Our sources are pretty stark about this.
Yeah.
In ancient Mesopotamia, a field of barley wasn't just a food source. It was translated directly into a clay tablet entry by a scribe. That tablet entry became a recorded obligation.
Yeah.
That obligation became a tax, and that tax literally became the hierarchy of the state. Barley was the ration, it was the wage, and it was the accounting standard.
The early state loves things that are legible.
Legible.
Yeah, measurable.
Yeah.
You can't easily measure and tax a scattered patch of wild berries in the forest, but you can measure a silo of barley with ruthless mathematical precision. You can calculate exactly how much grain a laborer needs to not starve to death, and you can pay them exactly that amount.
Okay, I have to push back a little on how dark this framing is, because I was reading this and thinking, is it really fair to say barley caused human hierarchy? It sounds like we're reducing the entirety of early human civilization like art, culture, urban living, to just human appetite combined with aggressive accounting.
It is a slightly cynical view, sure.
Right. So was the grain the cause, or just a convenient currency for power structures that humans were going to build anyway?
Well, I wouldn't say the plant itself generated human greed or the desire for dominance. Humans bring that to the table on our own. But it provided the material technology that allowed power to scale up.
Okay, I see.
You cannot build a standing army or a massive class of priests and scribes who don't farm unless you have a highly dense, storable currency to feed them with. Barley didn't invent the hierarchy, but the hierarchy could not exist without the biological realities of the storable grain.
That makes a lot of sense. And the research highlights Egypt specifically here, noting that the pyramids and monumental architecture weren't built by slaves dragging stones for nothing, like we often see in movies.
No, they were built by corvée laborers.
Right, corvée laborers who were paid in bread and beer. And this wasn't, craft beer and artisan sourdough as a fun weekend treat. This was the absolute bedrock wage of the ancient world. You received your daily measure of barley and emmer wheat, and that was your survival.
And that ancient beer is really worth exploring because it was vastly different from what you or I might drink today. It was a thick, highly caloric, slightly sour, nutrient-dense gruel.
Sounds kind of gross, actually.
Well, it was functional. It was hydrating because the boiling process killed the pathogens in the water, and the slight alcohol content acted as a preservative. It was essentially liquid bread.
Okay.
It allowed them to preserve grain calories and distribute them in a way that bound the labor force together.
Which is a perfect segue, actually, because if raw barley built the ledgers and the tax systems of the state, processed barley built a culture.
Very true.
We are stepping out of the bureaucrat's granary and into the brewer's malt house now. We have to talk about malting, which our notes describe as an act of controlled ruin.
Malting is, without exaggeration, one of the most elegant and ruthless biochemical manipulations humans have ever devised.
I was reading through the actual mechanics of this, and it reads like a biological heist. So a barley seed is mostly starch, right? Starch is just a long, complicated chain of sugars, but humans and yeast can't easily access that sugar when it's locked up in a raw, hard seed.
Right, it's biologically unavailable.
So the maltster takes a massive floor of dry, dormant barley and soaks it in water.
They trick the seed. They simulate the arrival of spring.
Exactly. The seed detects the moisture and the temperature change, and it thinks, all right, it's time to grow. It starts to germinate. A tiny little rootlet pops out. Inside the seed, it starts producing enzymes, specifically amylase enzymes.
And those enzymes are the key.
Yes, these enzymes are like little chemical scissors, and they start skipping those complex starch chains into simple, accessible, highly fermentable sugars. The seed is unlocking its own vault of energy to feed the growing sprout.
And this is where the heist happens.
Right. So right at the biological peak, when the seed has produced maximum enzymes and unlocked all the starch, but before the sprout can actually consume that sugar to grow, the maltster throws all the grain into a kiln.
It's brutal.
They blast it with hot air, they brutally dehydrate the seed, killing the sprout, but leaving those newly created enzymes and sugars perfectly preserved inside the kernel.
It's incredible. You basically wake it up just to steal its breakfast.
Yes, and that malted grain, which is now sweet, crunchy, and packed with potential energy, becomes the absolute soul of beer and whiskey.
In ancient societies, this biochemical heist wasn't viewed as industrial science, though. It was deeply sacred.
They thought it was magic.
Basically, yeah. The Sumerians worshipped Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. The hymn to Ninkasi, which dates back nearly 4,000 years, isn't just a poem. It's a literal step-by-step brewing recipe embedded directly into religious verse.
That is so cool.
The transformation of a hard, bitter, indigestible rock of grain into a sweet, intoxicating liquid that altered human consciousness was seen as divine alchemy.
It even birthed its own mythology much later in Europe with the folklore of John Barleycorn. Have you ever actually looked at the lyrics to that traditional English folk song?
I have, and it is remarkably dark.
It is so dark. Oh. John Barleycorn is the anthropomorphic personification of the crop itself. The song details him being buried in the dirt, which is planting. He grows a beard, which are the awns of the grain. Then men come with scythes and cut him off at the knee.
Right, the harvest.
They beat him with flails, they crush his bones between two stones in the mill, and they drown his blood in a vat.
It's the entire agricultural and malting process translated into a story of torture.
Exactly. But then the twist is that John Barleycorn rises from the dead in the form of alcohol, and he takes his revenge by conquering the men who tortured him, by making them overwhelmingly drunk. It's agricultural theology pretending to be a tavern song.
And notice how perfectly this maps onto the Devon subpersonality framework we started with.
Right.
The Devon persona is defined by the idea that its greatest utility, its profound sweetness, does not exist on the surface. It only emerges through controlled destruction. The crop must be subjected to intense discipline, pressure, and biological stress to unlock its true value.
But the research doesn't let us just romanticize the local pub here.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the deep moral duality of what we extract from this grain. Alcohol is the ultimate double-edged sword.
It really is.
Yes, it creates hospitality, ritual, and high-craft luxury like a beautifully aged single malt Scotch whiskey. But it also creates devastating public health crises. It drives physical addiction, domestic violence, and has historically been used as a tool for colonial manipulation. How do we reconcile this? We take this stoic survivor of a plant, put it through an ordeal, and create a substance that binds communities together, but also tears them apart.
The analysis in the text offers a very clear-eyed perspective on this. The plant does not absolve us, it merely reveals us.
Reveals us.
The molecule of ethanol is morally neutral. It is simply a magnifier of the human systems it enters. In the Devon framework, this is the demon days arc. It's the confrontation with the shadow self.
So the grain is just a mirror.
Exactly. If you introduce beer into a communal labor setting, like an ancient harvest, it binds the community and provides safe hydration. If you introduce it into a company town in the 19th century, it becomes a mechanism to keep the working class indebted to the company tavern.
Wow, yeah.
If you take distilled whiskey, it can be a masterclass in barrel aging and craft, or it can be a hyper-concentrated trade good used to exploit indigenous populations and strip them of their land and furs. The grain provides the raw energy. Humanity decides whether to use that energy for communion or for a cage.
That is heavy. But while the centers of empire were malting barley to fund their tax brackets and build their drinking cultures, the raw, unprocessed grain was living an entirely different life on the fringes of the world. Yes. Let's move to section 4 and talk about the marginal survivor. We are leaving the warm, noisy tavern and heading up into the freezing, thin air of the mountains.
Because as we established earlier, wheat is an aristocratic crop. It is demanding. It wants long, sunny days, rich soil, and reliable rain.
It's picky.
Very. When the soil gets poor, when the altitude climbs, when the frost comes early, wheat simply surrenders.
Barley pushes forward.
And nowhere is this more vividly illustrated than in Tibet. The research highlights a food called sampa. Sampa is essentially roasted barley flour. But it's not just an ingredient, it is the absolute core of Tibetan survival and identity.
We have to think about the physical realities of the Himalayan plateau. You are at an extreme altitude. Fuel for fires like wood or dried dung is incredibly scarce and precious. You cannot afford to waste fuel boiling raw grains for hours every time you need to eat.
So they pre-roast the barley grains before they grind them into flour.
Exactly. The roasting gelatinizes the starches, meaning it is essentially pre-cooked. When a Tibetan nomad or traveler is on the move, they don't need a cooking fire. That's brilliant.
They take a bowl, they add a piece of yak butter, pour in some hot tea, and fold in the sampa flour with their fingers until it forms a dense, doughy ball. It requires zero additional cooking fuel. It is pure, hyper-efficient culinary engineering.
It provides instant, complex carbohydrates from the barley, and dense fats from the butter in an environment that is actively trying to freeze you to death.
Yes.
The source actually notes that Tibetans are sometimes historically referred to as sampa eaters because the crop is so synonymous with their ability to simply exist in that harsh landscape.
But if we look globally, especially in Europe, this rugged resilience actually gave barley a massive cultural stigma.
The peasant grain.
Precisely. For centuries, wheat was the prestige grain. Wealthy people ate soft, white, heavily sifted wheat bread. The poor, the rural farmers, and the soldiers ate dark, heavy breads made of barley and rye, or they ate thick barley gruels. It was considered the food of desperation or fodder for livestock.
I want to dig into the chemistry of why that class divide existed, actually. Because why did human history decide that wheat was for kings and barley was for peasants? From what I understand in the research, it all comes down to a protein network.
It comes down to gluten.
Okay, gluten.
Wheat contains two proteins, gluten and gliadin, which combine when wet to form gluten. Gluten is incredibly strong and elastic. When you add yeast to wheat dough, the yeast burps out carbon dioxide gas. The strong gluten network acts like a series of tiny balloons trapping that gas.
And so the bread expands and rises into a soft, airy, massive loaf. The research refers to this as wheat bread rising with theatrical arrogance.
Theatrical arrogance. I love that phrase. It looks wealthy because it takes up a lot of space for very little actual substance.
Exactly.
Barley, on the other hand, does contain gluten, but it is a much weaker, less elastic structure. When yeast produces gas in barley dough, the bubbles just pop and escape. The bread doesn't rise much. It stays flat, dense, dark, and chewy.
It is a loaf of bread that forcefully reminds you that you are chewing on something pulled out of the dirt.
Exactly. The ancient elites despised it because they wanted food that was detached from the reality of agricultural labor. So when they did eat barley, they paid millers to violently scrub it, stripping away the tough outer bran to create pearled barley, sacrificing almost all the nutrition just to make it softer and whiter.
Which sets up one of the greatest ironies in modern food culture. Today, we're realizing that whole barley is an absolute nutritional powerhouse. I was looking into the specific mechanics of this. Barley is loaded with a soluble fiber called beta-glucan.
And beta-glucan isn't just some internet wellness trend. It has serious documented physiological mechanism.
Right. When you consume beta-glucan, it dissolves in the digestive tract and forms this thick, viscous, gelatinous gel. This gel slows down digestion, which prevents those massive blood sugar spikes you get from eating highly refined white flour.
It stabilizes everything.
But more importantly, that viscous gel physically binds to bile acids in your gut. Your body uses cholesterol to make bile acids. So when the beta-glucan traps the bile and flushes it out of your system, your liver is forced to pull more cholesterol out of your bloodstream to make new bile.
It literally acts as a sponge to lower your LDL cholesterol.
That is so cool. The clinical data on this is so robust that major, highly conservative regulatory bodies like the European Food Safety Authority and Health Canada have explicitly authorized health claims that barley beta-glucan lowers cholesterol and reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease.
So we have this incredible reversal. The exact same tough, fibrous bran that ancient aristocrats paid money to polish away and feed to their pigs is now being sold at a massive premium in modern health food stores to cure the diseases of excess that our refined diets created.
It is the Devon arc playing out on a macro scale. Society marginalized the tough, unglamorous utility of the grain when things were comfortable. We preferred the flashy, soft exterior of wheat.
But when the main system cracks,
When we face epidemics of heart disease and metabolic syndrome,
we suddenly have to run back to the margins and rely on the stoic resilience of the peasant grain.
So, hearing all this, you listening might assume that a crop, this impossibly tough a plant that survives the Himalayas and cures heart disease, must be the easiest thing in the world to farm today. You just throw it in the dirt and walk away, right?
Probably.
But as we transition into Section 5, looking at the razor's edge of modern farming, we see a deeply unsettling reality. We have taken this hardy survivor and, through industrialization, turned it into an incredibly brittle, fragile commodity.
We have to examine what happens when you industrialize biology. Modern farming is no longer about just planting seeds and praying for rain. It is about enforcing intense mathematical precision on a living organism.
The research highlights something called the Zadok scale.
The Zadok scale is a standardized system used by agronomists to track the exact developmental stage of a cereal crop. It goes from 0 to 100. Stage 10 is seedling growth. The 20s are tillering, which is when the plant pushes out side shoots. The 40s are the booting stage, where the seed head is swelling inside the sheath of the stem right before it emerges.
Why does a farmer need a 100-point scale for a grass? That seems excessive.
Because every single chemical application, fungicide, herbicide, nitrogen fertilizer, must be timed perfectly to those specific biological stages. If a farmer misjudges the moisture levels during tillering, the plant won't produce enough side shoots and the yield drops.
Wow.
If it gets heat stress during the booting stage, the grains inside the head will abort and the kernels will be thin and useless. You are micromanaging the plant's life cycle.
And the most mind-bending example of this micromanagement is the paradox of nitrogen. Nitrogen is the magic juice of modern agriculture, right? It makes plants grow big and produce high protein. Now, if you were a farmer growing feed barley meant to be eaten by cattle or pigs,
Yeah.
you want high nitrogen. You blast the field with it. You want maximum tonnage per acre, and you want high protein to build muscle in the livestock.
But if you are growing malting barley, the premium crop meant for the brewers and distillers, the rules completely invert.
This is the part that feels so cruel. If you put too much nitrogen on malting barley, the protein level inside the kernel spikes. And if the protein is too high, the brewers will literally reject the entire harvest. Why? Why do brewers hate protein?
It comes down to the architecture of the seed. Inside the kernel, you have a matrix of starch and a matrix of protein. They compete for physical space. If the protein levels are too high, it physically displaces the starch.
Brewers want the starch.
Right. Brewers don't care about protein. They want starch because starch becomes sugar and sugar becomes alcohol and flavor extract. Think of it like building a house. Starch is the bricks, protein is the mortar. If you have a house that is 50% mortar, it's structurally useless.
That makes perfect sense.
Plus, high protein in the brewing process causes the beer to become cloudy and hazy, and it can create off flavors and fermentation problems.
So a feed farmer wins with brute force and volume. But a malting barley farmer has to win with this agonizing discipline. You have to feed the plant exactly enough nitrogen so it yields a profitable amount of grain, but starve it just enough so the protein stays below a strict threshold, usually around 11 to 12.5%.
It requires nerve-wracking precision. And the cruelty of it is that the weather can override all of the farmer's math.
Because they can't control the rain.
Exactly. If you get a late-season drought, the plant stops plumping the kernel with starch, but it keeps absorbing nitrogen from the soil. The kernel shrinks, the protein concentration skyrockets, and suddenly your premium malt crop is instantly downgraded to cheap animal feed.
It's like training your entire life to be an elite structural engineer. You build a masterpiece of a bridge, and the inspector fails the entire project because the paint color is half a shade off. The farmer survives the drought. The crop looks beautiful in the field, but they go bankrupt because the protein tested at 13% instead of 12.5% at the grain elevator.
And that is before we even introduce the microscopic threats. The text brings up a fungal disease called Fusarium head blight.
I read about this. It's a fungus that attacks the crop during flowering, specifically when it's highly humid out.
Yes. When the barley flower opens to pollinate, it is completely vulnerable. If Fusarium spores land in that open floret during a wet spell, they infect the kernel. And the problem isn't just that it damages the yield. The fungus produces a mycotoxin called deoxynivalenol.
Which the industry delightfully refers to as DON, or vomitoxin.
Vomitoxin is exactly what it sounds like.
Yay.
It disrupts cellular function in the digestive tracts of mammals. If you feed high DON barley to pigs, they will literally refuse to eat it or they will vomit it back up. It is toxic.
And presumably brewers don't want toxic beer.
No. Because of food safety regulations, if a load of malting barley tests positive for DON above a minute threshold, usually around 1 part per million, it is entirely rejected by the maltster. The fungus is invisible to the naked eye, but its economic impact is absolute devastation for the farmer.
And even if you dodge the drought, balance the nitrogen perfectly, and avoid the invisible vomitoxin, you still have to store the living seed. Because, as we talked about earlier with malting, the maltster needs to germinate the seed later.
Exactly. The seed must remain alive.
If the farmer dries the grain with too much heat, or lets it sit in the humid silo where it suffocates, the embryo inside the seed dies. A dead seed can't sprout. If it can't sprout, it isn't malting barley, it's just expensive bird feed.
You are farming a living organism, and your job is to put it into a state of perfect suspended animation until an industrial facility hundreds of miles away is ready to wake it up. It turns the agricultural field into a spreadsheet with roots. The farmer isn't just battling nature, they're battling the unforgiving, hyper-specific constraints of the industrial supply chain.
Which takes us right into Section 6, the global chessboard. Because this strict grading system at the local grain elevator feeds directly into how this crop moves across the oceans. We are shifting from a local field in a rural town to the highly volatile theater of geopolitics.
We need to grasp the sheer scale of this market. We are talking about global production hovering between 142 to 155 million metric tons every year. The major power players producing this are massive agricultural blocks. the European Union, Russia, Australia, and Canada.
But the way it's traded is fascinating, because it is heavily defined by its identity as a substitute. The research explicitly calls barley a substitute feed grain on the global market.
Right. Let's look at China, which is the absolute powerhouse importer in this space. They bring in millions of tons of grain to fuel their massive pork and poultry industries. Corn is usually their preferred feed, but corn is volatile.
Okay, so if corn drops,
If the domestic Chinese corn harvest suffers due to flooding, or if global corn prices suddenly spike, China will rapidly pivot and buy up massive quantities of barley to substitute into their feed rations.
barley is the understudy. It sits in the wings, and when the lead actor corn or wheat gets sick, barley gets shoved onto the stage to keep the system running. But this creates an incredibly precarious reality for the farmers growing it. How is a family farm in Western Australia or Saskatchewan supposed to plan their livelihood when the price of their crop depends entirely on the diplomatic mood swings and domestic weather of superpowers on the other side of the planet?
They often can't. And the text provides a chilling, real-world case study of this from 2020.
The Australian tariff dispute.
Yes. In 2020, amidst broader geopolitical tensions, China suddenly slapped an 80.5% anti-dumping and countervailing duty on all Australian barley imports.
Just to clarify for you listening, an anti-dumping duty is essentially a tax a country imposes when they claim a foreign entity is selling a product below fair market value to crush domestic competition. But in this case, it was widely viewed as a purely political lever, not an economic reality.
Exactly. And the impact was instantaneous. Australia is a massive exporter, and China was their premium market. With the stroke of a diplomatic pen, an 80.5% tax made Australian barley mathematically impossible to sell in China. A billion-dollar export market was entirely wiped out, practically overnight.
And the Australian farmers had done absolutely nothing wrong. The crop was perfect, the Zadoc scale was managed, the vomitoxin was zero. But because men in suits thousands of miles away started playing geopolitical chess, the farmers were left holding silos full of grain that they suddenly had to dump into alternative markets at heavily discounted prices. The dispute dragged on until 2023, eventually requiring WTO intervention and long diplomatic negotiations to resolve.
It illustrates the profound vulnerability at the bottom of the export chain. This is the split identity of the crop. In a local subsistence economy, like the Tibetan village making tsampa, or an ancient farmer filling their own granary, a sack of barley represents ultimate food sovereignty. It is direct survival.
But in the modern export economy,
In the export economy, that exact same sack of grain is a pawn. The actual stable value of the crop is captured by the massive multinational grain trading firms, the corporate maltsters, and the global beer conglomerates. The farmer is left at the bottom, acting as a shock absorber for 100% of the weather risk and 100% of the political volatility.
the farmer grows the physical calories, but the corporation sells the mythology. That is a brutal realization. And as we move into the final major segment of our deep dive, Section 7, the moral ecology of a crop, we need to zoom out even further. We've examined the economic ledger of this plant. But what about the ecological and human ledger? When we plant 150 million tons of this grass, what does it actually do to the earth and to the human bodies handling it?
Ecologically, barley forces us to confront a split personality. It can be a healer or a destroyer, depending entirely on the scale of the system it is plugged into.
Let's start with the healer aspect, because sustainable agriculture loves this plant. Farmers use it as a highly effective cover crop.
Right. A cover crop is planted not necessarily to be harvested for profit, but to protect the soil during the off-season. Because barley grows incredibly fast and tolerates cold, a farmer can plant it in the fall after the main cash crop is harvested.
What does that do?
Its dense root system holds the topsoil in place, preventing winter winds or heavy rains from eroding the field. It outcompetes and suppresses winter weeds, reducing the need for chemical herbicides. In that context, it is an ecological hero.
But then you look at the other side of the coin. When it is grown as a massive 10,000-acre industrial monoculture, the story changes. To hit those exact protein and yield specs, it requires heavy applications of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer.
And nitrogen does not stay put. Excess fertilizer washes off the fields during rainstorms, running into river systems and oceans, causing massive algal blooms that suffocate aquatic life, creating dead zones.
That's awful.
Furthermore, synthetic nitrogen interacting with soil microbes produces nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas significantly more potent than carbon dioxide. A massive monoculture also strips the landscape of biodiversity, turning a complex ecosystem into a biological desert.
So the crop itself isn't evil. But the industrial scale forces an ecological cost. And we cannot ignore the human cost either, the labor risks. We started this deep dive talking about ancient corvée laborers being paid in beer to build pyramids. The coercion has changed, but the danger hasn't vanished. The research highlights severe, often hidden vulnerabilities in the modern supply chain.
We see ongoing issues with migrant labor abuses in large-scale agricultural systems. But even beyond the economics of labor, the physical reality of moving millions of tons of grain is terrifyingly dangerous.
The text brings up grain bin entrapments, which is something people who don't live near farms simply do not understand.
A modern grain silo is a massive steel cylinder holding thousands of tons of dry grain. Sometimes the grain clumps together and stops flowing out of the bottom auger. A worker will enter the bin to break up the clump.
Which sounds simple enough.
But if the grain suddenly breaks loose and starts flowing, it acts exactly like quicksand. The worker is pulled down into the flowing grain. Because grain is a granular solid, the pressure it exerts on a submerged body is immense. You cannot pull yourself out. Workers can be engulfed and suffocated in seconds.
God, that is a terrifying way to go. And even if you avoid entrapment, there is the silent hazard of agricultural dust. Moving that much dry plant material generates massive clouds of particulate matter. Workers face long-term respiratory damage, known colloquially as farmer's lung, from inhaling organic dust, mold spores, and dried endotoxins over a lifetime. It is a stark, brutal reminder that urban populations can only afford to romanticize agriculture because they are entirely insulated from the physical violence required to execute it.
But just as the crop reveals our capacity for industrial harm, it also reveals our capacity for incredible redemptive ingenuity. The research points toward the rising alternative non-food uses of the plant. We're learning how to upcycle the waste.
Right. After the combine harvests the grain, the field is left covered in barley straw, the dry stalks of the plant. Historically, that was just baled for animal bedding or burned. But now, it is being pulped and processed to make sustainable paper, reducing the need to cut down forests.
It is being broken down enzymatically to produce advanced biofuels, too.
And my favorite example,
Yeah.
it is being used as the primary biological substrate to grow gourmet mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms, for instance, use their mycelial network to secrete enzymes that break down the tough lignin in the barley straw. They literally digest the agricultural waste and turn it into high-value, nutrient-dense protein. We're even seeing companies compress barley straw and mycelium together to create biodegradable packaging and biocomposite building materials.
Which brings this entire exploration and the Devon subpersonality framework to its final perfect synthesis. The Devon persona is the embodiment of disciplined utility. It forces us to reject the childish binary urge to label a crop as purely good or purely bad.
Barley is completely agnostic.
Exactly. It has the physical capacity to hold precious topsoil in place or to require chemical systems that leave the earth sterile. It can be formulated into a medicinal fiber that heals the human heart, or it can be fermented into an intoxicant that shatters families. It can be a vector for exploited labor or a substrate for sustainable, futuristic building materials.
So it all comes back to us.
The research challenges us to stop staring at the kernel of grain and start interrogating the systems we build around it. Who owns the land? Who controls the genetics? Who absorbs the physical risk in the silo? And who captures the profit in the boardroom? The plant is entirely innocent. The human arrangements are what carry the moral weight.
Wow. Okay, let's take a deep breath and summarize the sheer scale of the journey we've just taken. We started with a brittle, shattering weed clinging to the dry, rocky hills of the Fertile Crescent. We watched early foragers unknowingly breed a genetic flaw into it, turning it into a crop that was so reliably storable it gave birth to the mathematics of taxation and the first centralized states.
A massive journey.
We saw it become the clay ledger entries of Mesopotamian bureaucrats, the divine beer that paid Egyptian builders, and the high-altitude roasted sampa that allowed humans to survive the freezing Himalayas. We followed its complex chemistry into the fiery kilns of the maltster to create luxury whiskey, watched it lower modern cholesterol, and saw it weaponized in the volatile billion-dollar trade wars of the global chessboard.
And the ultimate takeaway here is that to understand barley is to understand the mechanics of human civilization itself. It is the story of how we learned to engineer our own survival, how we figured out how to turn raw calories into institutional power, and how we learned the hard truth that sometimes the greatest utility and sweetness can only be extracted after you have completely crushed the seed.
We want civilization to be clean. We want agriculture to be a beautiful, sunlit painting. But it's not. It is muddy, it is complex, and it is built on compromise. And as we leave you today, the research offers one final, incredibly provocative thought, a question about the future of this ancient bargain.
Right now, modern genetic engineering, the pressures of climate change, and the demands of corporate agriculture are forcing us to breed crops purely for industrial comfort. We are breeding for exact protein levels, for maximum yield stability, for perfect, predictable uniformity in the malt house.
We are breeding out the struggle. We are selecting against the tough, bristly, stubborn defenses that allowed the plant to survive in the wild in the first place.
And the haunting question is this. As we slowly erase the genetic memory of hardship from our food, wait, scratch that. As we erase the genetic memory of hardship from our food, as we replace the bitter, unyielding survivor with a compliant, soft, industrial input, do we eventually lose our own capacity to survive when the environment inevitably turns hostile again?
When the climate shifts, when the global supply chain breaks down, you don't want the pampered aristocrat. You want the hardened survivor that knows how to exist in the margins. Something to chew on the next time you look at a bowl of dense soup or a pint of dark beer. That's our deep dive for today. Keep questioning the things hiding in plain sight.